Now that you know what is your options and we gone through some of the methods and the modules of D3 and what React, another library, has to offer, now we're ready to start creating charts. In this section, we're going to create some basic charts and we're going to progress from really simple charts to more complex one. And the way we're going to do it is the first chart we're going to create is the line chart. And the line chart we're going to create, I'm going to just be using D3. I'm not going to use almost any React architecture other than the function component itself. And then we're going to revisit that example and we're going to see how we can recreate that with different options and when we start thinking about interaction and animation. So let's get started. The first thing I want you to do is we're going to create a basic line chart. So you can either create it on your own or you can take help from, just like we did before, we can take help from our template. So if you go to the component and the README file, we're going to create a D3 based component. So again, npx generate react create React app, and it's going to be a component, and let's call it basic line chart. In terms of the data, I'm going to be using the Yahoo historical stock chart. So Yahoo has historical data. So for example, if you go to the Boeing, but you can choose really any stock, and you look at the historic data, you have a download link, so you can download this entire data here that you see with all those properties, and it's going to come as CSV. So I downloaded that, and you can see we have the date, we have the open, the high, low, close, volume. I downloaded that, and then what I did is I changed the formatting on the data, so it's instead of being a string like that, it would be in a way that it's easier to handle, and I changed the properties name, so date, value, and I deleted the rest. So we'll have some data to work with in order to create our chart. The first step we're going to do in terms of coding is you have to put the file line CSV. I'm putting it at the public data line folder, but you can put it in assets if you like. I like to put it there. It's going to move it automatically when I'm going to production. So it's a good place to put it. And the URL is easy to deal with. And then at the source component, we already have our basic line chart. Let's create a new file and let's call it types.TypeScript. And that's a common way to deal with types. So when we work with a CSV, we want to specify the type of that CSV data itself. And to do that, we're going to create a namespace with a type. And inside, we're going to export a type. Let's call it data. And this is the common way is to put uppercase because it's a type, but you can also use lowercase. It's up to you. Inside, I'm going to put a data string, and I'm going to put a value of type number. So that really match my CSV. Then in the basic line chart, let's do some cleanup. I only need the div, so I'll delete the rest. I'm going to take off the reference because I'm only going to be using D3 in this example. So we can collapse the div. Let's change the name to basic line chart with the lowercase. The reason that I'm using uppercase and I'm not setting up with lowercase is that the template is limited and it does replacement of token, the template. So it doesn't allow you, it's not as sophisticated as some other tools that allow you to change the cases at this point. So I need to do it manually, okay? Then in the draw, let's delete everything for now. For the properties, we're gonna pass the size of the component, so we'll use that. We're not gonna use the state, so I can delete that. Let's uncomment the properties. because we're going to be passing properties from the parent component, and we're not using a reference because we're going to use almost entirely D3. So now we have our component ready to be worked on. Let's change here so it's easier to see. So once the use effect hook is called, the draw is called, it's exactly as we did before. The first thing we need to think about is our space, our width and our height. So what we can do, and it's a common way to do it with D3, is to pass those properties from the parent's component. So that way we can track the width and the height of our document and set it from the parent component, and we can handle change as we're going to see in the next example. But now what we're going to be doing is we're going to set the width, and we need to set the height, and we can pass those from our parent component. So what we can do is we can set properties of width of type number, property of height of type number, the same of the top of the document number. So we can pass padding. So if we want to do any padding, we'll be able to do that. So the top, bottom, left, and right. Okay. Now in terms of our width, to calculate the width is the width of the document that we're passing, less the padding on the left and less the padding on the right. So we need to calculate that. So we're going to use the props width minus the props left minus the props right. That's going to give us the width. And similarly for the height, we're going to do the props height minus the padding of the top, right, minus the paddings for the bottom. So that's going to give us the height. Now that we have a width and height to work with, we need to go ahead and get our data from CSV. Luckily, D3 has a method that can help us do that. So if you do d3.csv or dsv, that we can actually deal with CSV data, and we need to put the delimiter, which is a comma, and then we need to pass where is our file, which is /data/line.csv, and then we can create a method to handle that. So we'll call the data of each element D. We'll put an inline function to handle that, and once the results are coming through, we'll call it res for results. We don't know the type of the data that we're gonna get, so we'll set it as unknown, and then we can cast it as if we do types, see, we can bring, oops, it's gonna be type. So if we do, hold on, let's take a look. Yeah, we call it type. So then we can cast it as type data, which we set at the type file. So what's going to happen is it's going to download the data, and then each one of those items is going to be set as a type data. Then the next thing we need to do is we need to kind of format the date, because we're getting, if you recall, we're getting the date. If you look here at the public data line CSV, see our data is being set with the dashes. So we want to handle that. So the way we're going to handle that, we're going to create a date constant, and we're going to use another method that we can use from D3, which is time parse. See, if you do time, you have all those different methods. So you can use time parse, and time parse, you need to specify the format. Now this really aligned to a lot of other datetime format utilities. So we need to specify the format that we're giving it, which is going to be the year, uppercase meaning the full year, and the day. And then what we want to do, we want to use that with our results. So once we're passing the results of date, that's gonna, hold on, data, okay, look, I have a typo here. I said it as data, it should be date, right? So I can change that, that's why I got the error. So once I pass the result data, it's gonna format the item as that type. Next is we wanna, after it handles that item, we want to take it and return it so we can use that. So we're going to return it with the same format. The date is going to be of type date, or we can write it short like that, just date, because it's the same name. And in terms of the value, we can use the result value. We haven't worked on it, so we're just going to pass it, the way it came before. And once that completed, we can use the then function that's going to be called after the data get back to us. We can call it data at this point. So this is the data that come back to us. What we need to do is we need to create scales. Those scales are what we use in order to take the numbers and the data we have and convert it into something we can display on the screen. So the way it works with D3, they have a built-in methods that we can pass in our data and what we expect in terms of the domain, meaning what is the data ranges. So the range and the domain. So we're taking the data, we pass it into a method, and then we can use those methods in order to generate the pixel location so we can display that on the screen. So we need to do it for both, for the X and the Y, because our line chart has an X, it has an X, and it has a Y. So we need to create scales for that. So let's do that. We'll call the scale X, let's call it X, and then we can use D3, and then we can use the scale time, because our X is a time scale, okay? And it takes, to set it up, we need two things. We need to set the domain, meaning what kind of data we're passing, and we do that by passing our data that we loaded from our CSV. So we call the D3 extend, so it's going to take the whole data that we're passing, and then we can iterate through that data using an accessor. So the accessor we're going to be using is the data accessor. So it's going to iterate through the data, and it's going to use the date accessor to create our X scale. Now I'm getting an error because we need to cast it, right? So instead of the domain, we need to make sure we cast it as our type, which would be a date type. So if we do date, it's always return an iteration of both of them. Now on the return, it doesn't like the D because we haven't passed it. So in the accessor, we pass the D, which is our data. And then we tell the accessor we're going to use the date. And now the last thing we need to do is we need to set the range. So the range of that accessor is going to be either a 0, the range meaning in the when we display it. So it's going to start from 0 on the screen and to the width of the screen, right? So from 0 to width, and that's going to be our X accessor. Now, if we want to test our scale, what we can do is a few things. First of all, let's add our component to the screen. So let's add, I'm going back to app.tsx, and I'm going to be adding our basic line chart. And let's set the width and height. So let's set the width as, let's say 800. The height, let's set it as 400. And then top, let's give it a 10 padding from the top, a bottom 50, and left and right 50 as well. So now it's gonna edit the component. Let's see, it's complaining. I didn't close it. Now go back to the basic line chart component, and if we want to test it, what we can do is we can do console log, or we can just create a variable. So if we create a variable test equal x that domain, that should give us the domain. I can console log it if I want to. So let's put a actually a line breakpoint here, and if I'm running it in debug mode, let's see. Okay, and if I'm running it in debug mode, you can see that we have here our test has the two dates, the beginning date and the end date. And you can see it if you go back into your line CSV file, you see that the opening date was January 27, you see it here, 2020, and the closing date was December 28, 2020, and you can see it here. Now, if we want to do even more testing, we can pass a date, and then we can see the location that the scale is going to assign to it on the screen. So I'll show you how you can do that. Since our type is, let's clean this up first. Since our type is of d3 date, we need that parser again. So if I take that parser, the date parser, and we can set it up here again. So if I have that parser and I pass in a date, for example, I'll take the first date, our scale method is going to convert that date into the pixel on the screen that we would expect. So if we do X and we pass in our date, let's see, it's complaining, it needs to be of type date. Here you go. So if we set it that way, let's do it a little bit different. Let's create another variable. Let's call it again test. So constant test equal our x, and then we pass the date. Then we expect that to be 0, because our range is from 0 to the width of the component. Let's take a look. You see our date, hold on, let's run it again. Okay, here our test came in as 0 because we're passing the first date. The same time, if we pass the last date, we would expect to get really the width of our chart. Since we passed the width, which is, if you remember, the width is the width of the chart that we set minus the padding, the left and the right. So the left and the right were 50-50, so it should come back as 700, the last date. Let's take a look. Test. I think we have to run it again. Let's see. Here we go. So you see our test is 700 because that's the width of our document. So, and all the dates, all the other dates in the CSV are going to be in between the 0 and the 700. Just like we saw when we called the domain. Now to draw that, the axis peripheral on the screen, we need to first create an SVG tag because our tag is just a div tag. So we need to add an SVG tag. So what we can do is we can create a constant, let's call it SVG, and then we can use D3 to select our, let's call it ID instead of a class. I like ID better. So we'll set an ID, so we can have D3 select the ID, and then what we can do, we can append an SVG tag, and we can set the attributes for the width and for the height. For the width, it's going to be, our SVG is going to be our width minus, we can just set it, we can set it as the width, and then we can add the padding, or we can use the width and then reduce the padding. So it's up to us how we want to set it. Let's set it so it's a little bit, we got that extra space, so plus property right, and the same with the height. We'll set the height plus the property top plus the properties bottom. Okay, so we got the attribute. Then the next thing we need to do is we can append a G tag, so we can put our chart inside, and we can set the attributes of the G tag using the transform. And I'll use a template style, and I'll do a translate. So the G inside will set it to the left top corner to start. All right, so we'll do, using the template, it's going to be property props of the, we want the left corner to start it from the left top corner. So left top corner. Okay, so now that we have an SVG, see, okay, errors are gone. Now that we have an SVG element, we can go ahead and draw our peripheral, our axis. So the way we're going to do that is, what we can do is we can take our SVG and append a G element, and then set the attribute for the transform to translate from 0. We want to start it from 0 to the height of the chart that we decided it to be, which we can pass, the size of our window or component that it sits inside. Then what we can do is we can call a method that's built into D3 called access bottom. See, you can set the axis on the bottom, on the left, the right, top. So we'll use the access button, and that's going to draw for us our axis at the bottom. And what we're going to do is we're going to pass our scale that's going to use our our accessor with all those values. So it's going to use that to draw our x bottom. Let's take a look. Okay, so you can see it basically drew our x accessor. It drew our axis at the bottom using the accessor we set with the domain and the range. So you can see that here. The next one, the next scale we need to build is the Y scale. For the Y scale, let's call it Y, and we'll use again the D3, and we'll use the scale linear. That's going to be our Y scale. So it's those running numbers of the price over time, and we need to set the domain. Our domain again is going to be between 0, because the price can be 0, right? And then we can use again D3 max method that will give us the maximum value, and the maximum value we can iterate through our data using our value accessor. So D will be one of the items, then we can return the max of our entire data set and map we can't use data again, so I'll do dt, and inline function I can use dt, and then we need to cast it as our type data, and then we can use the value. There you go. And now the only thing we need to do is we need to set the maximum between the value of each item and 0, because we want the highest number. It's complaining. Let's see why. Because it's complaining because it needs to return, it's expecting to return 2 numbers. So what we can do is, after we use the domain, we can cast it as type number, because that's what D3 expect. Okay, so now it works. So now we have the domain, and the last thing we need to do is we need to set the range, and our range is going to be between, because this is we're going to use the y accessor for the y axis, so the range is going to be between the height that we set or 0, right? So it could be either the height of the document, or 0, and this needs to be in an array, those 2 values. And now what we can do is we can add that to our screen by adding another group. So we can append a group element just like we did before, and in our group element we can call, just like we did before, the D3 axis. This time we want it to the left, so we're going to X to the left, and we're going to pass the value, which is the Y scale. And if everything went well, let's take a look. Cannot find Y. Let's see. I forgot to put constant. Okay, so let's see. conversion of type data may be mistaken because it's insufficient. So it doesn't like that I converted it to type data. What we can do is add unknown. Here we go. So if you add unknown, because it doesn't know what kind of type we're passing on, here we go. So you can see we got the value of the yx and the value of the xx. We got two problems. First of all, our x-axis is shown at the top instead of the bottom, and we don't see the value here. So let's take a look. First, here is the x-axis. You can see the translate. I didn't close the bracket, so let's close the bracket. Let's go back. Okay, now it shows at the bottom. And then here you could see we have, we don't see the full values. If I'm zooming out, you can see the values are here, but it's not showing it. Check our bounds of our container. You can see here we do translate from the left top corner, but the width, I'm using the width with the left and the right. So we don't need to use the left and the right because we're doing translate already from the left. So we can get rid of the left. And here we go. Now we got our y-axis and our x-axis. The last thing we want to do is we want to draw the actual chart. To draw the actual chart, we can use a path with the line, and that will get us, and then use the data, passing the data to draw the chart. What we can do is we can take our SVG element and append a path element, SVG element, and then we can go through the data. So we can use either data or data datum. The difference between the data or the datum is that if we assigning our SVG into just one SVG element, then we should use the datum, either the data or the datum. If we want to attach multiple, then we can use the data with the enter. Since we have only one line for our chart, we can use the datum or the data. So it's up to you. I'm just showing you both options. And now we need to add an attribute. So we can add the fill. So our fill is going to be in the beginning. We can set it as none. And we can set attribute for the stroke, because we don't want to fill inside of our line. That would be an area chart. What we want to do is we just want to show the line itself. So we'll use the stroke. So we can use tomato for our stroke color. And next thing for stroke, we can set the stroke width. So that would be the size of our line, right? And we can set it, for example, for 1.5, 1.6. We'll see how it looks like. Now what we can do is we need to set the attribute and iterate through our data. And then we need to, when we do that, that's where we can really actually draw our actual line. So what we can do is we can call d3, and then we can use the line function, and the line function will take an x and a y. So our x is going to be, so it's basically going to iterate through our data, and we can pass a d would be one data point in our data. And what we're going to do is we're going to return the data using our scale. This way it's going to give it, the actual location on the screen. So what we can do is we can just pass the D that we're setting. It's of type data. And our data point, we need to take the date, right? It's giving us an error probably because it needs to set first to be converted to unknown and then as our type. Let's see. What's happening here, first of all, our ESLink is set to give error when there's an overload. So what we're doing here, we're overloading our TS script, so we can use TS ignore. That will take care of this error. And now it has a problem here because that method, the X, is expecting a number and our date method is passing a string. So we can fix that by casting this, our date is a number. But you can see it's pretty crazy conversion for TypeScript. It's an overkill, and this is a great situation where using TS ignore is not a bad thing because we don't want to go through those crazy statements just to get the date. What we can do is we can get rid of all of that and just do date that's D, which is the data item, that date, and just add a TS ignore because it's an overkill, and that's where TypeScript sometimes doesn't make sense to to convert it to the exact object, and this is one of those situations. And the same for the Y. For the Y, we're gonna pass in the data and we're gonna return our Y scale using d.value, and we need a TS ignore here. Again, I can convert it to unknown and then to our type and then to a value, but we don't need to do that. It's an overkill. So let's look. Here we go. So we got our line chart. One problem that you may be seeing here is that when I resize my chart, it doesn't get resized. So it is working, but it's not resizing. The reason that it's not resizing is because I took over the DOM. So React doesn't know what I'm doing with the DOM, is not aware of, I'm adding a div, I took out the reference, and in the next example, we're going to refactor that so React knows what's happening and we'll let React take over redrawing when needed.